I'm not a fan of heavy-duty boots and what they do to the game. I generally have liked hazards' presence as tools to keep really, really strong Pokemon in check. Uh, and you can point to all the times where Pokemon are unaffected by hazards as examples of this, like Cinderace in Gen 8. It puts on heavy-duty boots and it becomes insanely broken. Gen 5, Alakazam and Reuniclus, they don't care about hazards. They're ridiculously difficult to deal with. And Clefable, Gen 4, 6, 7, 8. I mean, it's nuts what being completely immune to hazards will do. So, I was starting to question this recently because I was thinking, how healthy is that? And it's also in the sense that I don't like heavy-duty boots because it's pretty much, if hazards are really busted, you need to use this item, and then that kind of skews it in the favor of the Pokemon who are using the item, and it's more unbalanced, as opposed to a theoretical tier where there are no hazards at all, and you are not putting boots on your defensive Pokemon just so it can keep up with that offensive Pokemon also running boots and not getting worn down. So there is precedent for this, obviously, in RBY. And whatever people say about RBY, one of the universal praises RBY gets, even from people who, despise it, is that they really like what no hazards does to the game. In that you are much more able to play your way back into a battle, because the only damage you are taking in RBY is when the opponent attacks you. And there's no, I can get up a bunch of hazards and then phase you around forever, and this really is what led me to my questioning of, if it's, I mean, okay, people have been complaining about hazards for a while, for a long time, in fact, and whether or not they're healthy. But what really has been on my mind, really hammering this point home, is just how much of our metagames, for decades, are centered around hazards. Like in RBY, it's Pokemon on Pokemon. And from Gen 2 on, obviously you have, Skarmory counter Snorlax. You're not going to beat Snorlax entirely through spikes. But so much offensive and defensive pressure in Gens 2 through 9. But, I'll just say Gens 2 through 7 because, Boots changed it a lot. We already went over that dynamic where it's like, oh, well, the Boots Pokemon is more favored, so it's kind of like, well, let me run Boots on all these pokes. And people really hated, Boots in conjunction with switch moves. Oh my god, what a nightmare. You got your U-turn, Volt Switch, Teleport. Oh, nightmarish. But, to go back to the original point, hey, I actually managed to not veer too far off and actually come back to what I was talking about. Progress. Point being, that so much of the offensive and defensive progress in the game, I guess progress isn't the right word for defense, but I guess I did stumble for a second. Yeah, so much of the way we structure our offense and defense is not just around, getting hazards, but getting hazards against opposing measures of preventing or removing them. Maintaining them over the course of a game when you're going to set them up. I mean, in Gen 4, here's a good example. Gen 4, Stealth Rock came out and everyone was like, oh my god, this is the greatest move in the game. It's calculated to do 200% on average, and you just gotta have it. Every team needs it. And I do believe that in Gens 4, 5, 6, 7, well, maybe not 7 when you run those crazy triple defog teams. Yeah, that was a thing that was used in Gen 7. Some people were using teams with like triple defog. So, yeah, that's what hazards do, because the idea is that with no hazards on the field, these Pokemon, or these combinations of Pokemon become unbreakable. but so much of it is centered around the passive, not just or the most specific passive damage aspect of it. But before we get into the whole, oh well, we need hazards to keep things like Stall and Volcarona and Dragonite in check, whatever, we will get to that. But I wanted to go back to the Gen 4 point, just for the power of hazards. So Stealth Rock is a huge deal, and everyone's like, oh yeah, rocks, you need it on every team, all that stuff. And then you started getting your suicide leads, like your Azelf and your Aerodactyl, whose entire purpose is to lead off, get Stealth Rock, and get KO'd. And obviously it's more simple than that. You don't just get rocks up and die. You get rocks up and start the game off with crucial momentum, and if your team is constructed well, that it can ride that momentum to a win, right? But doesn't it say almost everything about how powerful rocks are, that is a viable strategy? I mean, sacrificing an entire Pokemon just for rocks? I mean, rocks and spikes, okay, that would be something else. And that's why, historically, Deoxys forms in OU have been crazy broken. But and whereas their replacements like Custap Skarmory are not nearly as dominant in that field. Although they can still get a lot of runaway games. But it's just the rocks and die aspect alone. Because, like, with Azelf, at least in Gen 4, you could say, oh, well, it'll get rocks and boom. It's not just get rocks and die, by the way. It's get rocks and prevent the opponent from getting rocks. Because so much of how you deal with Pokemon like Gyarados is by getting rocks. And then they come in at 75, and then they're a million times easier to deal with. And it's often... You often really feel the power of flying types in gens with rocks and how much you rely on them to deal with when something like, when you can't maintain rocks and then something like a bold Zapdos comes in and just stonewalls your entire team. You're like, yeah, wow, I really need rocks for this. So, people from the Gens 1 through 3 era, at first they were scoffing at the very idea of suicide leads. Like it was a joke. It was like this dumb U-Gen player thing. It was like, can you believe those Gen 4 players sacrifice an entire Pokemon just to get up rocks? But, as the results were showing, yeah, that could be kind of a good strategy. When you're getting this incredibly powerful hazard with so many of the strongest Pokemon in the game following it up, and preventing the opponent from their own, from getting up their own hazards in retaliation. Because a lot of the time, the best way to deal with hazards is to match them with your own hazards. I mean, whenever a Skarmory comes in Gen 3 and starts using spikes, what is one of the most common occurrences? Oh, well, the other player goes to their Skarmory and starts spiking. So, the same with rocks. It's like when this is not restricted to just suicide leads or dedicated leads with taunt and sleep and whatever else to prevent opposing rocks. In general, if you have like a dynamic where your rocker is Heatran and the opponent's rocker is Ferrothorn, and you get Heatran in real quick, it's like, well, you're getting rocks up and they are not matching your hazards, so you have a hazard advantage for several turns. And that can be a really big deal. So just that kind of hazard dynamic is something that has really been on my mind. And you're probably saying, okay, Kev, well, what about that whole Volcarona and Dragonite of it all? It's like, okay, yeah, some Pokemon might be a little bit busted. But to that, I would say two things. Number one, it's a lot easier to deal with threats like this when your own walls aren't taking hazard damage. And you can see this not just in RBY, but in the more high-powered environment of Gen 8, which admittedly I have not kept up with in a long time. But I remember from following it from the sidelines, it's like, yeah, well, your walls need boots, otherwise they're going to get outlasted by threats with boots. So you see the dynamic there. So yeah, in general, when your defensive Pokemon aren't taking hazards, then it becomes so much more easy to deal with things like Vulcan, D-Knight, and whatever other rocks weak threat. Well, what about defensive cores with rocks, without rocks to deal with? Things like Regenerator are so good, even with hazards in the picture. So what about without? Yeah, I mean, maybe. But at the same time, these teams that are just trying to regenerate all over the place are not famed for their offensive pressure. The reason they're scary is because they get up hazards and then they switch around while you can't switch around. That's why so many metagames have devolved into longevity battles in the face of hazards. I'll get back to that in a second because that's a really big point. But the other point I wanted to make insofar as, oh, well, don't we need rocks to keep so-and-so in check? It's like, yeah, but we've also banned things for ignoring hazards or making it too hard to get hazards. And it's not just Cinderace in Gen 8, but in Gen 6 in Oris, Mega Sableye was banned from OU because in conjunction... And yes, some people would say, oh, well, Dugtrio was in the tier. It's like, yes, but Mega Sableye was still too... I do not agree with those people who think Mega Sableye would be fine without Doug. I think its presence for the game was really bad in that it could just completely stuff so many Stealth Rockers. And it just made the game so much more restrictive and matchup oriented, which is generally things you don't want in a metagame. And then you think about it, it's like, yeah, this thing's biggest crime was... I mean, it also did things like prevent taunt and whatever, but it was, by and large, making it like, oh, you're running Stealth Rock, Spikes, Ferrothorn? Well, enjoy never getting hazards. Or, making it extremely difficult and restrictive to do so. So, yeah, the fact that Mega Sableye was banned because, in conjunction with the defoggers, it made it so ridiculously tough to get rocks up. That's a big deal. So to go back to that point I was making about those longevity wars, yeah, so we've seen this in so many metagames, from Gens 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then a lot of times spikes become really good, right? Because what happens tends to be people realize that spikes are strong, the spikers are really strong, they're great Pokemon like Skarmory and Ferrothorn. And they realize that the removal options are kind of bad. I remember when Gen 6 came out, people were like, oh, spikes are dead because we have defog now. And then I was like, yeah, okay, sure. Anyway, people realize that removal options are kind of bad. Prevention options, yeah, if you're running offense, like really, really hardcore offense, maybe. But if you're running anything balanced, then you're not going to be preventing the hazards. You're not Also, it's hard to prevent the hazards in general, even with offense, because the defensive Pokemon are so good. The Spikers are such great defensive Pokemon because they take on so many opposing Pokemon. That's what gives them their opportunities to spike. So prevention is difficult. Removal winds up being, futile. In a lot of cases, because it's like, oh, I have my Spin Starmie, my Defog Gladius, oh, there's Scarf Tyranitar, there it goes. Oh, then there's also the fact that they can't even switch into Ferrothorn in the first place. All that stuff, spin blocking, pursuit, not being good against the hazard setters. It's, that whole little mini metagame of, like, the hazard setters and the hazard abusers, and a lot of the times the best hazard abusers wind up being those that are not affected by hazards themselves. And I'm not just talking about Magikarp here, but think about how much of a threat Poison Heal Gliscor with Swords Dance has been Gens 5, 6, 7. And you realize, oh yeah, it's about these teams realizing, look, if spikes are going to go up, okay? If you're not playing at the most screaming fast tempo imaginable, and even then, that tends to happen, then spikes are going to go up. And when spikes go up, then things get really hard to deal with. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to remove spikes? It's like, no. If you have to deal with spikes, like if spikes are going up, you want to use Pokemon that are not as affected by them, right? Because then it's like, oh, well, I don't care that my opponent has 3 layers of spikes in the first 3 turns because I have 4 to 5 to 6 Pokemon that are immune to them, so the effect is minimized. As opposed to, entire teams. Because a lot of good Pokemon get hacked apart by hazards. But, of course, there are plenty of good Pokemon that are immune to spikes in particular. It's not just spikes, obviously. It's also spikes and being good against Stealth Rock. because like these Superman teams. I have a video called Superman in Advance OU if you want to check that one out. But like Superman has really transcended Advance, and it's moved on into all those other gens I'm mentioning, 4 through 7. And it's not just about being immune to spikes, but it's about being immune to spikes while not minding rocks as much. And there's a major difference between something like Gliscor and something like Dragonite. Because Gliscor, its Poison Heal means that Stealth Rock effectively does not exist for it. All Stealth Rock does is prevent it from getting more Poison Heal recovery, but you're not actually chipping. Yes, okay, you'll have examples like, oh, well, it switches in and takes 12% on the switch, and then... Point being, Poison Heal cancels out Stealth Rock in a vacuum, right? As opposed to Dragonite, like, oh, well, it's bulky and it has Roost, but it's weak to Stealth Rock, and that makes it so much more easy to take advantage of when you got your rocks up and you're forcing switches. It's a world of difference. So you prefer things like the Lottie twins, or, the Mega Lotties in 6 and 7. Where it's like, okay, Stealth Rock neutral, but Spike's immune. That's good enough. That's generally the idea. Even when the Mega Lotties don't have their passive recovery in lefties. Oh, speaking of lefties, not that they would necessarily keep them anyway, because knockoff is everywhere. And if you really are terrified of boots or of hazards with boots, then you gotta worry about knockoff being spammed everywhere. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem either. Anyway. So, gen after gen, people realize, I gotta use these teams that are more hazard resilient, because this game's gonna go on for a while, and I can't be getting, eaten alive by all these hazards. I gotta be able to withstand their pressure over this long game, over this war of attrition. So, when that is the case, then you wind up getting teams... that look very similar, because there are only so many Pokemon that can deal with spikes and, not be terrible against Stealth Rock. Skarmory is, of course, another one. We've been seeing a lot of teams that try to go full spikes immune in Advance. And not that they can't be good, but they have their own issues. But, and then the whole metagame dynamic is so centered around... it's not just, oh, these teams are used because they're good against hazards. Like, all right, well, what's good against these teams? So-and-so Pokemon, right? Well, you want to use that because these teams are good against hazards, and you're trying to not use a hazard-centric approach, because then you're just going to, set up 3 layers of spikes against a team with 5 immunities, and it's not going to be as impactful. And then the metagame goes to a more hyper-offensive... pace, team style, so on, where you just try to overwhelm the more balanced approach these hazard immune teams like to take. And then you start seeing more balanced teams that try to, withstand the offensive team better, because, certain defensive Pokemon are really good against offensive threats, but they don't do so well in when spikes are absolutely everywhere. A lot of bulky waters in particular. And it's hard to use these defensive Pokemon with something like Spin or, Defog, because, again, removal is not so good. So basically you have this triangle, and I'm simplifying a lot here, by the way. I don't necessarily think this dynamic is bad. In fact, the metagames I'm talking about, I like a lot. So I don't think that dynamic is bad at all. I'm more saying, I'm wondering, really, because I don't have an answer, a true yes or no answer to that question in the title. I'm just wondering if it's, the healthiest option for so much of this to be dictated by the hazard game. Because it is. You realize, oh, well, spikes are going to go up, so I gotta go, spikes immune. But those teams tend to be more aggressive, but not full out, not perfect in terms of dealing with wall, or, not perfect in terms of walling, I should say, rather. So, they're not true stall. I mean, they're aggressive. They particularly excel in beating other bulkier teams, right? If you have, like, a spikes ignoring semi-stall or balance, then you are generally going to ruin stall teams, because stall teams' pressure comes from passive damage, and you don't care about that, because you got your Magic Guards and your Gliscor, which is essentially a Magic Guard Pokemon in most cases, and so on. right? So you're going to devour them, but you might not. I mean, Volcarona is public enemy number one for these teams because the number one method of dealing with Volcarona is getting hazards and then just playing around it, right? Yeah, unless you're throwing Chansey on every team, which, again, Chansey would not fit on such a team because it is famously destroyed by hazards. But Chansey is good on, really fat teams that are all about the bulk and all about out-bulking these hyper-offensive squads. And you are not going to... So you see the triangle. And I'm oversimplifying it, but generally, Superman spikes ignoring balance stuff is great against, super fat wall stuff, because those walls, you don't care about them. They're not doing any damage to you. But then you get scared by faster, more hyper-offensive stuff. And then the faster hyper-offensive stuff gets more stuffed by things like Chansey and Unaware and so on. And I don't necessarily think this matchup triangle is that simple, insofar as it's decided by team preview. I don't think that's the case at all. I think there are plenty of good spikeless teams across the gens that can deal with Volcarona well, and I think there are plenty of non-spikes ignoring teams that can deal with the spikes ignoring teams. Or spikes ignoring bulky teams that can deal with the spikes ignoring teams, for example. I think there's plenty of hyper offense that it can bust through, the Unaware, Chansey stuff kind of stall. But I'm illustrating how those kinds of teams exist in the first place in relation to each other, and it is all about dealing with hazards. Now you might wonder, hey, if the metagame's fine, what's the issue? And to that, I would say, yeah, of course, I would absolutely agree. I don't have problems with these metagames. I was just thinking about the alternative, where we're not dealing with hazards at all. So it might be a fun, experiment, because sometimes you're team building and you really start to feel the pressure of all those hazards and how limiting it can make your options. And I generally think, again, that hazards keeping things in check are a good thing, but you can really feel that squeeze. Because I don't think that a metagame should have endless creativity, because that's how you get randomness and variance and team choice and weird matchup stuff happening all the time. I think metagame should be centralized around something. I'm just wondering if maybe the alternative without hazards is more balanced. I don't know. It's something you would really have to try extensively in a tournament format where people are invested in not just throwing random stuff together. I will say that in Gen 5, there was briefly a stealth rockless metagame. Not spikes ban, but just, banning stealth rock. And people were saying all sorts of stuff, like, oh, focus sash is going to be broken and dumb stuff like that. I mean, that was kind of a concern in early Gen 4. Like, oh, that was why people were spamming stealth rock so much. So early on in Diamond and Pearl, they were like, oh, dude, you got to get up rocks to break Lucario's sash and stuff like that. It's kind of funny. But yeah, the people were at first wondering, oh, dude, Sash Volcarona, it's going to be so broken, Breloom, all this other stuff. Even putting aside spikes for a second. But then people really realized that, hey, what was really constricting was, having to run these walls that are also good against rocks. And then when certain walls are used that, because of their resilience to hazards, that opens up really exploitable team patterns. So, for example, in Gen 5 OU, you got these teams that are really good at ignoring hazards, and they famously get cleaved open by Mamoswine. Absolutely shredded. Forget Volcarona. Mamoswine is the true sand killer, which is why it's so popular on Rain. It's also great on sand. And you're thinking, well, why don't they just pack a Mamoswine counter? It's like, well, first of all, you can't counter Mamoswine. He's too strong. But, in more serious terms, it's also, you're really not going to find a Pokemon, well, I mean, outside of Bronzong, but that gets knocked off. And, point being, it's difficult to fit Pokemon like Rotom and Slowbro on those teams that are, maybe not Rotom as much, but well, even Rotom, it's not quite a Spikes abuser in the same way. More on Spikes abusers in a second. But it's difficult to fit those Pokemon that are able to both fulfill your defensive requirement, i.e. being good against hazards, and countering these Pokemon. So in Gen 5, it winds up being, oh, you're very hard-pressed to find an Ice Resist, or a good Ice Resist, which is also why Shell Smash Cloyster was such a big threat. So that's one example. What was I just going to say about... oh, I think that was it. It'll come back to me in a second. We'll just watch this... this game. If not, if it doesn't come back to me, then someone can just point it out in a comment, and I'll answer it in the comment and pin it. Yeah. This game just happened a few hours ago. It was a pretty good one, but it was also, you know, the effects of hazards. Now, again, I know like the idea of something like Gen 2 without hazards would be, you know, probably pretty nice. I don't know though. I don't know. You know, the power level in Gen 2 is pretty high once you take Snorlax out of the equation. You know, and all the proof you need of that is, you know, once Snorlax goes down, a lot of teams get cleaved open by a lot of threats. And, you know, Blissey's, of course, always there to try and go super fat, but, you know, then Blissey doesn't have much offensive pressure itself without hazards, without, you know, the one layer of spikes supporting it. So, it is just a thought. Because I know a lot of people have expressed, you know, myself included at times, have expressed displeasure with how restrictive and limiting the hazard pool, or the no, I think that was it. I think that was the example I wanted to give. That, you know, when you build teams that are resilient to hazards, then you wind up getting, in Gen 5, for example, you get utterly thrashed by Mamoswine. Volcarona tends to be pretty nasty too, because things like Heatran and Chansey are, you know, famously destroyed by spikes, and so you're not fitting them on those teams very often. I mean, Heatran sometimes, but Chansey not so much. Now, what's funny is that hazards are not the only factor with such impact. Can my security license thing go away? Thank you. They're not the only such factor with such metagame shaping impact. Like, look at the generation on the screen right now, Gen 3, which is so shaped by sand that sometimes you just have a T-Tar on your team, and you're like, okay, I'm fine against Snorlax and Suicune. You know, oversimplifying it for a second. But Pursuit, you know, I've had similar thoughts about Sand, about Pursuit, how restrictive they are, and generally I wind up with the answer, yes, look, it's good that they keep these things in check. You know, look how nightmarish all those Specs Shadow Balls were in Gen 8 when you couldn't Pursuit the ghosts using them, right? But, you know, so other times I think, I wonder what it would be like without. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. We're going to just... finish this game. It was actually pretty good. Actually, you know what? It's been a while since I took a signature BKC bathroom break. So I'm going to do that while this game plays out, because I think I said everything I wanted to, more or less. So I will be back in a minute with my concluding thoughts, including this video's movie recommendation. So BRB. Yeah, for those new to the channel, they're like, did that guy really just go for a bathroom break and not edit it out? Well, first of all, I don't edit nearly any of my videos because I hate it. It drives me nuts. And yeah, a well-hydrated man such as myself is constantly going to the bathroom. It's a sign of good health. Anyway, this week I am recommending the film I am about to rewatch for the first time in I don't know how long. I've only seen it once, but I love it. So, powerful, powerful film and a favorite of mine. It is a movie from 1981 called Possession. I'm sure most people watching this have seen Jurassic Park, and they like that guy from that movie. Oh, what's his name? Oh, Sam Neill. Yeah, he's in this one, and well, let's just say I prefer him in Possession to Jurassic Park. It's pretty great. So I recommend that. And oh, this game was really nice, by the way. You got some hazard dynamics there, and yeah. So just think about how much your favorite tier is shaped by hazards. And if you play an RBY tier, you're like, oh man, it's so nice that I don't have to deal with hazards. Can you imagine dealing with Tauros and stuff with hazards? Ugh. My goodness. Anyway, that's about all from me. I look forward to a comment section that says, oh my god, I watched Possession, it was the greatest thing ever, and I think I lost my mind. What happened? What happened to Sam Neill? I'm kidding, I like Sam Neill. But Possession, Isabella, Johnny, oh my god. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.